Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Alan Sokal, a professor of mathematics at University College London and professor emeritus of physics at New York University. He is author of the infamous Sokal hoax from 1996 and co author with Jean Bricmont of Fashionable Nonsense Postmodern Intellectuals' Abuse of Science. His most recent book is Beyond the Hoax Science, Philosophy, and Culture. I welcome Alan Sokal to Savage Minds. When you did that hoax, my first reaction, Alan, was a bit of like, oh, how dare he? He's just a physicist, right? Now, I had my inner woke child. I was also in my 20s, and I was, I'll be honest with you, very unaware as to how deeply rooted the problems were. Hence, here we are today in 2021, and I look at my former self and I'm thinking, what were you thinking? Because I was in, I did comparative literature and anthropology. I was very well schooled in both post structuralism, postmodernism, and postmodernism in its various formats, from literature, which is quite different than architectural postmodernism, which is also
Right.
quite different from the theory. And even if you ask people working in the humanities or social sciences today, the difference is many will not be aware of all of these various camps because they're not uniquely interrelated. Actually, this is part of the problem. People will say Kathy Acker is a postmodern was a postmodern writer, but in fact what makes a piece of literature postmodern does not necessarily apply to a piece of architecture, and certainly does not apply to identity politics. So that was then. And then I wrote you a few years ago saying mea culpa. I told you the story by email about how I was at NYU teaching when your hoax came out, and my initial reaction and my feeling guilty about it because you were right, I was wrong. Now,
Well, those things happen. I've been in that situation too.
now here we are where we're living in a world where people are arguing that testosterone has nothing to do with being male, that there's such a thing as a female penis, and that science doesn't really matter. It's how I feel inside, my true self. And you are a trained scientist. You were the author of the Sokal hoax, as it's known now, from 1996. Can you tell our listeners what got you invested in trying out the hoax?
Well, yeah. So, sometime in the spring of 1994, I saw a notice. And the truth is, I can't remember where. And when I try to find it now on the internet, I can't find it. But anyway, I saw a notice somewhere or other about a new book called Higher Superstition: The Academic Left and Its Quarrels with Science, written by Paul Gross, a biologist, and Norman Levitt, a mathematician. And I first thought, oh no, there they go again, another one of these right-wing diatribes about how the Marxist feminist subversives are taking over our universities and brainwashing our children. There had been a whole spate of those books in the late 80s and early 90s. And then my second thought was academic left and its quarrels with science. I mean, that's a little bit strange. I mean, I'm an academic leftist. I don't have any quarrel with science. And I didn't know that the academic left, or at least some of it, did have a quarrel with science. So I got the book and read it and learned about a whole quite heterogeneous group of people who were criticizing both the content of natural science, so biology, chemistry, physics, and so on, and the philosophy, the prevailing philosophy of science, and were making a complete botch, as I saw it, of both. And so these were people coming from a whole variety of different backgrounds. You had postmodernist literary critics. You had social constructivist sociologists and anthropologists. You had so-called feminist epistemologists. You had advocates of post-colonial theory. Um, and the interesting thing about these critiques, it wasn't like the science for the people critiques of the 1960s, which were criticizing the complicity of the scientific and technological establishment with capitalism, militarism, environmental destruction, and so on. I mean, those are critiques that I think each one has to be examined on its own merits, but in general, I'm sympathetic to those critiques. Um, and nor was it like the feminist movement of the 1970s that criticized discrimination against girls and women in science, or criticized sexism in some aspects of biology, psychology, and medicine. I mean, again, um, those are critiques where each one has to be analyzed on its own merits, but in general, I'm sympathetic to those critiques too. But this was different. These people were claiming that the content and methodology of the entirety of modern science, so that means, um, astronomy, physics, and chemistry, no less than biology and psychology and medicine, all of this was somehow um, uh, irredeemably infected by uh, patriarchal, capitalist, and colonialist ideology. And so I read the book, and my first thought was, "Oh, come on, are these guys really being fair to the people they're criticizing? Maybe they were exaggerating. Maybe they were uh, taking a writings that are, you know, moderately criticizable and making them sound totally ridiculous. Or maybe they were criticizing minor figures in these fields while overlooking the solid work done by the major figures." So what I did was I ran to the library and looked up some of the articles and books that Gross and Levitt were criticizing. And in the end, I decided that basically they were right. In about 80% of the cases, uh, the things that they were criticizing were as bad as they said, and actually in a few cases even worse than they realized. In the other 20%, my feeling was that they had taken some writing that was mediocre, but made it sound worse than it really was. But those are questions of judgment. But anyway, so I had gone to the library to verify that Gross and Levitt were basically on the right track, in my opinion. And then, but I had, in doing so, amassed a much bigger dossier of um, totally flawed and in some cases off the wall claims about about two fields that I actually know something about: physics and mathematics, and the philosophy of physics and mathematics. People making off the wall claims about these things with no apparent knowledge of what they were really talking about. And some of these were by people who were quite famous. Um, so then I thought, what should I do with this? And I remember I even had an email at that point with my friend Lee Smolin, and I think I said something like, it would be an interesting exercise in an artificial intelligence class to write a computer program to generate a postmodernist essay. Uh, but then I thought, no, natural language is much too difficult. That would be much too difficult. I actually didn't know that a computer scientist in Australia was almost at the same time writing just such a program, which you can now find on the internet as the postmodernism generator. But anyway, so I, after writing this email, I went to the toilet, and that's where I get most of my good ideas. And while sitting on the toilet, I said, well, maybe it would be too difficult to write a computer program to write such a program, such an article, but I could write such an article. So the point was, if I were to write an article just criticizing these these writings that I had found, basically, I think it would end up in a black hole. No, nobody would read it. I mean, it would be, it would be an addition to the critique of Gross and Levitt, but it wouldn't really have much effect. So I had the idea instead of doing something that would be um, well, a parody, a hoax, and in a certain sense, an experiment, although it's admittedly an uncontrolled experiment. So my idea was to, instead of writing an article criticizing these people, to write an article praising these people. So to invent a, a storyline, an argument woven around the worst quotations that I could find from the about mathematics and physics from the most prominent intellectuals, which in this case were about half French and a half Anglo-American, and and so basically build a nonsensical argument around these quotations and to try to do it in the style that would be that's fashionable in these fields that Gross and Levitt were critiquing, and then try submitting it to a fashionable journal in one of those fields to see if they would accept it as a serious article. So that was, I guess that was in the summer of 1994. And it took me about 3 months to write the article. I had to, revise and revise until it reached the desired level of unclarity. Um, and but I have to admit it was fun. It was fun because I could just put in the craziest, um, not exactly stream of consciousness, but the craziest, sentences with buzzwords that don't actually mean anything, um, and um, or in some cases, some of the things admittedly were in jokes for mathematicians and physicists, making a play on words, for example, between the axiom of choice in mathematics, which is a very, very technical proposition from set theory, and relating it to pro-choice positions on abortion. And so anyway, so I had a lot of fun writing this article, and so it took about 3 months to write it, I think, as I recall. And so I decided to submit it to Social Text. Social Text was, or I guess is, a fairly fashionable journal in the field called cultural studies, which I guess you know more about than I do, but my feeling is that it's people practicing sociology without a license, which is perfectly fine. I'm perfectly, I don't really, I'm joking. I don't think that anybody should have to have a license to write about something. After all, I've written a lot about philosophy of science, and I have no degree in philosophy at all. So that's not the problem. But basically, cultural studies is, my impression is that it's people from a literary background trying to write about sociology and politics and so on. And that's fine. What they write should be evaluated on its merits. So anyway, so this was a fashionable field, at least in the American and British academies in the 1990s. And Social Text was one of the fashionable journals in the field. And two of the editors of Social Text, namely Andrew Ross and Stanley Aronowitz, were among the people prominently cited in my parody article. Of course, once I realized that I was submitting it to Social Text, I of course played the game of stuffing in as many favorable citations to the editors of the journal as I could. Flattery a good way of getting your article accepted. But anyway, so I decided to submit it to social text, and uh, and then I had to wait and see. And so what happened was, unbeknownst to me, they were organizing a special issue of their journal. That issue was going to be entitled Science Wars, precisely in order to attack Gross and Levitt. And so what must have happened, of course, I'm not privy to the discussions of their editors, but what must have happened is that they thought, oh my God, a real scientist on our side in the science wars. And so that was a positive thing for them, despite whatever deficiencies they found in my article. They never made very clear what it was. And in fact, I was hoping, to get detailed referee reports, detailed criticisms from them, and I didn't. I mean, they wanted me to shorten the article. It had too many footnotes, and
too many footnotes. It's like Amadeus, too many notes.
But I mean, that's my style in my real writing as well as my parody article. I mean, I use a lot of footnotes. I like using a lot of footnotes, and in this particular case, I couldn't remove the footnotes because some of the best jokes were in the footnotes. So I made some excuses about how I had to include the footnotes because my scientist colleagues are going to read this and I have to defend myself. I gave some good excuses and they agreed. So basically, the article was accepted more or less as is. That must have happened by about April 1995. And then here's the complicated thing. So they accepted the article for this special issue, but I had no idea when this special issue was going to appear. This was April 1995. It turned out that it appeared in April 1996, a year later, but I didn't know that. I had no idea. And as this thing was progressing, the number of people who were in on the hoax was increasing. I mean, basically, even before I submitted it, I tried it out on various friends, both scientists and non-scientists, to see whether whether it would pass, whether some of the things were too obvious, and so I got various suggestions from various friends before I submitted it, and then gradually this circle increased. Somebody would say to me, I've got a friend who is a professor of cultural studies at UC Santa Cruz, and she's written lots of articles against postmodernism, and she's not listened to by her colleagues, and I think she would love your article. Can I share it with her? And I would say yes, but you have to swear her to secrecy. And so gradually the friends of friends of friends, all sworn to secrecy, are becoming aware of this. But of course, I had no idea when it was supposed to go to publication, and I had no idea when some of the secrecy would accidentally fall apart. Right? I mean, it's a little bit like COVID. You have hundreds of thousands of people infected, and even if they try to quarantine, some of them will transmit it. And so I was deathly afraid that my little experiment would get undone before it was published by the news leaking out.
Let me read the title here for our listeners because I'm sorry. It's so funny. Transgressing the Boundaries, because as you, I'm sure, noticed, all the humanities have colons and subtitles. They're extremely long. Towards a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity.
I did notice the thing about the colon. In fact, I have to, if you give me a second, I'll try to pick it up on my computer. In about 10 years later, in 2008, I published a book with Oxford University Press called Beyond the Hoax. With that, and the first chapter of the book was a reprint of the parody article, together with, on facing pages, annotations on the parody. And actually, one of the annotations says exactly as you notice. I'm reading it to you now. It says, current practice in the academic humanities dictates that titles must begin with a gerund, consist of two phrases separated by a colon, and contain at least one play on words. Furthermore, the title should preferably give as little information as possible concerning the content of the article.
It is very funny to read. There's this part, I'm sorry. It's so funny because at the time when your piece came out, I hadn't actually read it. I heard about it first before I read it. And reading it is hysterical, especially when the hoax was revealed, because there's this will to follow a text all the way through, like watching a bad movie, right? So you refer to Bohr, and then you say this foreshadowing of postmodernist epistemology is by no means coincidental. The profound connections between complementarity and deconstruction have recently been elucidated by Frula and Hohner, and in great depth by Plotnitsky. What was your thesis here?
Right. So the point is, of course, I can't remember even the articles of Frula, Hohner, and Plotnitsky, but the point was all of those references are trying to stuff into the bibliography the worst commentary that I could find about, in this case, quantum mechanics, from people in, literature, cultural studies, coming from a postmodernist angle. So, but with a few exceptions, everything praised in the article is an example of one of the writings that I'm trying to criticize. Um, and but most of them are from fairly unknown people, so I didn't make a big deal about it. That's why they're mostly hidden in the footnotes. Um, but then the biggies. If I'm trying to remember my way through the article, I mean, the article was organized as a tour through the biggies. Uh, so right. So first I softened the readers up, but soften the reader up by uh, citing Bohr and Heisenberg about quantum mechanics. And so here I have to say, I'm extremely critical of the things that Bohr and Heisenberg wrote in their popular writings about quantum mechanics. Some of the popular misunderstandings about quantum mechanics can be laid at the foot, in part, of those first physicists who wrote, I don't know, they exaggerated various things about quantum mechanics and paraphrased things in ways that led to many, many misunderstandings. So they wrote some things that did indeed sound, in some sense, postmodernist. And so I quoted some of these things to soften the reader up. And then the rest of the article is a tour through the biggies. So let's see, in which order do I hit the biggies? I'm just looking through this. So there's first.
Well, it's interesting too because a lot of these people who you mention are New York based. So I can only imagine how it was when you would bump into them. Andrew was at NYU. I think he was the head of American Studies at the time.
Yes, I had to be super, super careful there. He invited me to lunch, and I had to make all sorts of excuses, because it's one thing to write an article pretending to believe in something that you absolutely don't believe in. It's another thing to dissemble in person. I'm not a good actor. So I had to make all sorts of excuses for why I couldn't have lunch with him. Indeed, his office was, one block away from mine. Um, and, so that, and I have to say, by the way, um, you know, uh, obviously he was upset after this thing came out. It was very embarrassing for him, but it I think after a while it was not personal. um, 5 or 10 years later, I forget which, we were on the same side of an issue at NYU. We were both supporting the graduate students' attempt to organize a union, which the NYU administration was opposing. And so, in faculty meetings, he would say something, and then I, 10 minutes later, would get up and say, as Professor Ross eloquently said, blah, blah, blah. So this was,
Right.
of course, probably very amusing to the other faculty members who heard it, but it was true, you know.
But it's interesting because this is all a lesson for leftists. I mean, like yourself, I am a leftist, and I find myself homeless politically in recent years over what your paper made fun, your hoax made fun of, has become, ironically, more emboldened. And we're living in an era now
Yes,
where
absolutely.
many people
And
on the
I'd like
left, as
to,
I'm sure
maybe
you
we could come
know,
back to
are
that a
buttressing
little
narratives
later,
of
kind
internal
of do this
identities over
in
material
a little bit in
reality.
chronological order, but I think you're absolutely right. The postmodernist ideas have come back more and more front and center, albeit in an evolved way. So going back to my parody, so I organized it around. So the biggies were actually French. So the biggies were Jacques Derrida,
Jean-François Lyotard.
Jacques Jacques Lyotard played a minor role actually, but Derrida, Lacan, and Luce Irigaray, who is, I guess, actually Belgian, um, and I think the three major sections of the article were organized around them, if I remember correctly, and then a whole lot of um, lesser known academics from the English speaking world. There was a sociological difference in the people I was citing and parodying in the different countries. In the Americans and Brits and Australians that I was citing were, for the most part, tenured professors in good universities, but not well known outside of their fields, and virtually unknown to the general public, because, in, at least in the United States, hardly any intellectual is well known to the general public. Um, on the other hand, in France, the people I was criticizing were stars. They were intellectual stars. You'd see them constantly in Le Monde, in Libération, and even from time to time on television. And so it's just a difference. The In the American system, the United States is a largely anti-intellectual country. By contrast, France has an intellectual star system. And I mean, of course, I'm critical of both things, but so that was an interesting sociological difference between the two sides of the people I was criticizing and parodying. But anyway, so the article was accepted. Should I tell the story of how the hoax was almost revealed?
Sure.
This is an amusing story, which unfortunately hasn't been told very much. So about, as it turns out, only a few weeks before the article was published, but of course I didn't know that because I didn't know when the article was going to be published. I got a call from a 27-year-old freelance journalist saying that I'd like to talk with you about your upcoming article in Social Text. And I wasn't surprised about that because Social Text, had actually advertised in various publications this forthcoming issue on Science Wars, together with the names of the authors. So when the journalist asked me this, I played dumb and I just said, "Oh, I see you're interviewing all the all the authors for this upcoming special issue. And he said, well, yes, but I think your case will be more delicate. What's up here? So I played dumb, but I agreed to meet him at the New York Public Library a few days later. And so basically, I had resolved to play dumb for 5 minutes. And if he said, I think that your article is a hoax, I'd say, yes, you're right. Congratulations. Let's go talk to your editors. Oh, because here's the funny thing. The journal that he was working for as a freelance journalist was Lingua Franca, which unfortunately is no longer in existence, but was a wonderful how do I describe it? Sometimes some people call it the People magazine of academia, but of course it was much more serious and sophisticated than that. It had interesting articles about controversies or scandals in academia, and it was especially useful because you could find out about fields other than your own. So it was a really interesting journal, and of course, I should say, I was planning eventually to reveal my own hoax. I wanted it to be published. I was going to wait 6 months or a year to see what the reaction would be. That would be part of the experiment. See, would people praise it? Would people criticize it? Would people ignore it? I figured most likely people would ignore it. But I wanted to see. And then 6 months or a year later, I would submit an article outing myself. And the journal I had chosen for that was Lingua Franca. And I had already written in advance the article outing myself. So when I went to see this freelance journalist, David Glenn, at the New York Public Library, I was carrying a copy of this article outing myself. And so when he said, I think that your article is a hoax, I said, congratulations. Yes, you're absolutely right. Let's go talk to your editors. Because it turned out that Lingua Franca's offices were only a few blocks away. So we walked over. His editors were expecting to see him. They weren't expecting to also see me. But it was a funny thing. So I should tell a little bit about how he put it together, because he did incredible detective work based on rather minimal clues, and unfortunately, he never got proper credit for it. So he told me this story. He said, one night he I guess he was either a graduate student in sociology at City University of New York, or was at least in those social circles. And he was at a party where, people were drinking and people were making jokes about or telling stories about Stanley Aronowitz, one of the sociology professors at CUNY Grad Center, and also one of the editors of Social Text, in which I later found out I had cited him approvingly 13 times in the article. I didn't realize it was so much. And so people were telling I don't know what you call it, gossip about him. And one person apparently says, I hear that Social Text will soon have egg on its face. So I have no idea this must be of a friend of a friend of a friend who found out about my hoax and accidentally spilled the beans here. So, but with no more details than that, I hear that Social Text will soon have egg on its face. So David Glenn, goes to sleep, and the next morning, once he's gotten over his hangover, wakes up and remembers that he's a freelance journalist. And this sounds interesting. Social Text will soon have egg on its face. So he calls the person up and says, could you tell me more? And the person says, I think I've already told you too much, which makes him even more intrigued, of course. So he goes to his editors at Lingua Franca, and they make a plan. So the first thing they do is they look at the most recent issue of Social Text to see if there's anything embarrassing in that, and they don't find anything. So then they figure it must be the upcoming issue. And they know that Duke University Press, which is the publisher of Social Text, has a policy of making advanced galley proofs of their journals available to journalists, who might want to publicize them. So Lingua Franca puts in a request for the upcoming issue of Social Text and for 3 other Duke University Press journals just to cover their tracks, to mislead Duke University Press about what's going on. And then when they get the galley proofs of this upcoming issue, they go through the 16 articles, and they find that 15 of them are a little weird, and the 16th is a little weirder. And so at that point, they suspect that my article is a hoax. And so David Glenn put this all together by amazing detective work, based on a really, really tiny clue. But unfortunately, he never got proper credit. The reason is, when we were talking with his editors, they had a deadline coming up soon. And they said, if they were to publish David Glenn writing a news article about this, it would be only fair they would have to contact the Social Text editors for their point of view, for comment. But they had no idea when Social Text was coming out. So if they had a deadline, they would have had to contact them immediately. But if Social Text had not yet gone to press, they could undo their whole story, right? Social Text could pull my article from their journal. I mean, as it turns out, Social Text had gone to press then and was going to come out more or less simultaneously with Lingua Franca, but they didn't know that. So the editor made the decision that instead of running a news article by David Glenn, they would run my article, outing myself, and then give the Social Text editors an opportunity to respond in the next issue a month later, which is what they did. But that was fine for me and for the Social Text editors, but it meant that David Glenn never got proper credit for the amazing detective work that he did. So I feel bad about that.
In your explanation of the experiment, you said, to test the prevailing intellectual standards, I decided to try a modest, though admittedly uncontrolled experiment with a leading North American journal of cultural studies whose editorial collective includes such luminaries as Frederick Jameson and Andrew Ross. Publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if A, it sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions.
Right. And then I didn't actually add, but I should have added, and C, flattered the editors personally. That was that was a small ingredient too. But I think flattering their ideological conceptions was the important thing. This is the unfortunate thing. Andrew Ross had coined this term science wars for the debate between, well, various people on one side and Gross and Levitt on the other, by analogy with the so-called culture wars that had been happening in the United States for the past 5 or 10 years, so late 80s and early 90s, where a bunch of right-wing cultural commentators were writing books against feminism, deconstructionism, leftist approaches to history, various things which they claimed were taking over the universities. And so Andrew Ross and his colleagues framed the so-called, what they called science wars by analogy with that, and painted Gross and Levitt as right-wingers, which is not true. I mean, Gross, I don't know him very well, but I gather that he's a fairly typical liberal in the American sense. And Levitt, I got to know quite a bit better. He was, I have to say unfortunately, he died rather young in 2009. but he was a member of Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, he described himself as a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture. So, you know, you can have your opinion on that, but he was definitely not a right winger. Um, but the the crowd that was attacked by Gross and Levin wanted to frame it that this was a right wing attack. Well, they wanted to frame it two ways. There was a right wing attack, and that it was an attack by scientists trying to preserve their own turf. Uh, and and some of the people even afterward, so you had in the several years afterward when this debate was raging, you had sociologists writing, that scientists were using these social and cultural critics as scapegoats for the declining public support for science and the declining public funding of science. And the truth is, I think that has nothing to do with it. I mean, that the funding of science is a totally different problem, but I certainly don't blame the postmodernists and the deconstructionists for why right-wing people in the government were cutting funding for science. I mean, one has nothing to do with the other. But that's anyway how they framed the debate, as right-wing scientists versus left-wing literary and cultural and social science people, which is a little bit strange because it's an inversion of the two cultures debate from the 1950s, when C.P. Snow painted the humanities as right wing and the science as left wing.
Well, that's exactly what's happened today. Just with Helen Joyce's recent book released this week, there have been accusations because of her pointing out within the text certain links between the funding of the transgender movement and the backers, who happen to be, by the way, she doesn't mention this, happen to be Jewish. She's been accused of being right-wing and anti-Semitic. And all the feminists for the last 10 years I've been following this subject have been accused of being right-wing, even though you have groups right there in London, like Women's Place UK, Fair Play for Women in the UK, etc. And there are many groups that are to the left. So the whitewashing is still happening, where any dissenting voice to the current narrative of even liberal orthodoxy is automatically painted as being right-wing.
Obviously, left and right are overly simplistic words. There are a bunch of different lefts and a bunch of different rights, and it's not just one thing. I mean, this was true already, in the 1990s when I was writing. So in addition to getting tagged as a right winger, I was also being tagged as a Marxist. So that I'm a Marxist who cares only about economics and is unable to see any other kind of oppression, race or gender or whatever, which is of course also ridiculous, right? I mean, first of all, I'm not a Marxist. I mean, I do think it is important to look at economic class, but I also think it's important to look at race and gender and all these other things. So already, even in the 1990s, you had to some extent a division between leftists who tended to focus on economics and leftists who tended to focus on other types of identity issues. And I mean, I personally, fall in the middle there. But so anyway, be that as it may, so that was what happened with the hoax being published, and then when it was published, I should say, by the way, what did I expect was going to happen? Well, two things. I didn't know if it was going to be published. When I submitted it, I didn't know if it was going to be accepted for publication. Um, and I can prove that I gave it 50-50 odds of being accepted for publication because I offered two friends who were in on the hoax a bet, allowing them to bet in either direction they preferred at 1-to-1 odds of whether it would be published. And the winner would have to pay for dinner at a nice restaurant in New York for the loser. And both of the friends bet that it would be published. So I lost both bets and had to pay up with the dinner. Um, so I gave it a 50-50 chance of being published. But then what would happen if it was published? Well, I figured it would be a minor scandal in a small academic community, that it would be page 10 of the Chronicle of Higher Education. I had no idea, absolutely no idea, that it would be front page of the New York Times. I mean, granted on a slow news day, but still, I had no idea that it would be front page of the New York Times. And then 6 months later, after the word gradually percolated to France that some of the people most satirized in it were great French intellectuals, then it was front page of Le Monde. And I had no idea that that was going to happen. I mean, my wife can tell this story. When it came out, I was at a physics conference at the University of Minnesota, and she started back in New York. She started getting all these phone calls from journalists. Then she referred them. I don't know. I guess the secretaries at the University of Minnesota were having to field all these phone calls for me. And some of them were from network television. I turned down all of the television interview requests because I didn't think that television would be serious. That would feed into the general anti-intellectual culture. Let's make fun of the pointy-headed professors kind of thing, which was not my intention at all. So I turned down television, but I did do an interview with National Public Radio. And so in fact, must have been, now that I think about it, it was NPR that I did first. And then the next morning, the New York Times did it. And then all hell broke loose. So I had not the slightest idea that it would hit such a chord, not just in academia, but in at least, some part of the general public. I mean, in retrospect, I guess I underestimated the interest that, people, ordinary citizens have in science, politics. I mean, all the different issues that were touched on by the hoax, and also, I think I even looked up the statistics that at the time, I think something like 50% of adult Americans had attended some college, and 25% actually had university degrees. And so, so that means there's a significant cohort of people who may have taken a cultural studies or women's studies course that was a little too heavy on Derrida and Lacan and all these people. And they may have thought, oh my God, I'm really stupid. I can't understand a word of this. And then they were maybe thrilled to find out that the fact that they couldn't understand it was maybe not their fault.
Well, of course, at the heart of this too, Alan, is the fact that they did accept a paper that was designed to use their own hokum against them. And I was in the humanities then, and what I saw was a lot of digging down rather than understanding that perhaps we ought to use language more responsibly and not put how to deconstruct identity everywhere in every paper in every class seminar.
Right. So digging down, you mean?
Yeah, they dug their heels in and decided we're going forward.
Yeah, I think. Well, you have more direct knowledge of it than me, obviously. Probably it varied a lot from place to place, but yeah, I think that was certainly one of the reactions. What what does this physicist know about our field anyway?
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Around 96, 7, 8, there started to be these master's programs designed for the knowledge curation of. So you would have museum studies, curatorial studies, and those started to blossom and they would merge with, as you know, NYU, there was a lot of merging of programs and degrees with the Stern School of Business. And you'd see joint degrees being offered because there was this idea of, well, you can have your humanities and eat your cake too, as it were. So match a humanities degree up with a business degree. The problem is that what you were critiquing, and when I say departments dug down, I'm not even saying that's necessarily a bad reaction to what you did, because the first reaction to any kind of shock to the system, logically, I think would be a digging down, because that's what people do. That's what we're seeing today around identity politics. People are digging down. The protests in Los Angeles these past 2 Saturdays over women saying we don't want men in our sauna when I have my 6-year-old child naked. People are actually saying, again, they're digging down, saying, no, but if he identifies as having a female penis, what's wrong with that? So we have this mismatch between what people actually think, what they really think behind closed doors, and what they say on the streets or for a CNN camera or for their friends in their woke circles. And so I think the reaction to your hoax, of course, was to dig down because departments didn't have a lot of choice. Remember, you pointed out the culture wars that sort of got going with the likes of Jesse Helms critiquing Robert Mapplethorpe's photos and Cindy Sherman, etc. And of course, that also that group of the right wing, the moral majority, they dug down too when they were being critiqued. They would not let up, and they sought to disembowel arts funding in the States, and they were quite successful at it, if you recall.
One thing I wanted to say about the 90s, not everybody dug their heels in and kept doing the same thing. So, for example, I think some of the people who were embarrassed, like, for example, Andrew Ross, who had written some fairly silly things about science, he went on to do other things. And in fact, quite good things. He wrote a book about sweatshops. He helped to uncover, when NYU was building a campus at Abu Dhabi, he helped to uncover the exploitation of foreign workers that was happening in the construction of that campus. So, in fact, he got himself, I think, deported from Abu Dhabi, uh, and so some of the people went on to do different and, from my point of view, more justifiable things.
What you were confronting with your hoax pushed on the boundaries, but those boundaries didn't really begin to crumble until the last 10 years with feminists, especially in the UK, where you are now, pushing on these boundaries when it came to discussing women's rights, women's spaces, women's own definition of themselves. Because you're in the thick of it. I lived in London and got involved with this movement over the last 10 years because it came to my doorstep, as it were, by feminists in central London saying, are you aware that the transgender movement has, and they started to describe to me, and I thought, I was very involved in gay rights in New York. And I said to this person, this sounds a bit far-fetched. I don't think so. And I was in denial because I just thought this person revealing some of the incidents that she was telling me about was inventing or exaggerating. And I went back to my computer, started to research, and found out that every bit that she had told me was completely accurate. And I'm speaking about council persons elected in various parts of the UK who were redefining what woman meant, redefining the way that women could talk about themselves, and redefining what would be considered a legal restriction on women's rights to say no to men. And this has come about, as I'm sure you've seen in recent months, with many scholars and writers and artists. I've been detailing this for 10 years now. I've been speaking to people like Rachel Rooney, a children's book author, who has been hounded so badly that now she and many others are finding themselves with no career because editors avoid making contracts with people who are designated TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. And this is actually a far more volatile proposition for our society, where Jesse Helms was arguing about the decency of Robert Mapplethorpe's white and black buttocks juxtaposed within the frame. We are back to science being completely undermined by hokum, where now we're being told that sex is not real, that humans are not sexually dimorphic, and that men can become women.
It's not, I mean, it's not even, a great discovery of modern science. It's something that humans have known since the beginning of being humans, that obviously the divided into male and female with, I gather there's, I don't know, 0.1% of exceptions, but just about everybody else is male or female.
Yes, intersex conditions are extremely rare, but those individuals within the intersex community have also pushed back on the trans community because they say, stop hijacking our
Right,
existence to suit your purposes. And
right.
as you know, you have colleagues there at the UCL, such as Alice Sullivan and Judith Suissa, who have been working on this subject. I've interviewed Alice here.
Oh, good.
There are many other women who've been active in this, and there have been labor activists. You've had women's organizations popping up everywhere. You have individual women going out and doing their own thing. You have mothers with no time to do very much, but in their spare time, they are writing the BBC saying, why did you put a show up with absolutely no women on the panel? This happens all the time. So you have taken issue with science, not just from the hoax, but since the hoax. You spoke about this in a lecture that you gave. What is science and why should we care? You asked what, in fact, the four distinct meanings of science mean for us today, in a sense. You say that science denotes an intellectual endeavor aimed at a rational understanding of the natural and social world, that it denotes a corpus of currently accepted substantive knowledge, that it denotes a community of scientists with its mores and its social and economic structure. And finally, you say it denotes applied science and technology.
I wanted to make those distinctions because a lot of people, when they talk about science, blur together those four things. And the analysis of those four things has to be radically different. And sometimes people make valid criticisms of technology and then assume that it therefore is valid as a critique of science as a way of understanding the world. And of course it's not valid. It's just a misuse of words that allows people to think that it's valid. So I wanted to start by making those distinctions and then saying what I was going to concentrate on in the talk. I say, I'll be concentrating on the first two aspects, that namely an intellectual endeavor aimed at a rational understanding of the natural and social world and a corpus of currently accepted substantive knowledge. And then I would make some secondary references to the sociology of the scientific community, but I wouldn't address technology at all.
You get at in this talk the whole notion of substantive knowledge. What does that mean when you add a corollary to those 4 points, where you say, you talk about fallibilism as I'm quoting you, the understanding that all our empirical knowledge is tentative, incomplete, and open to revision in the light of new evidence or cogent new arguments. And then you go on to cite Bruno Latour, who did somewhat of a U turn to his previous work, which I found quite beautiful what you quoted of his. He wrote, while we spent years trying to detect the real prejudices hidden behind the appearance of objective statements, do we now have to reveal the real objective and incontrovertible facts hidden behind the illusion of prejudices? And yet, our entire PhD programs are still running to make sure that good American kids are learning the hard way that facts are made up, that there is no such thing as natural, unmediated, unbiased access to truth, that we are always prisoners of language, that we always speak from a particular standpoint, and so on, while dangerous extremists are using the very same argument of social construction to destroy hard won evidence that could save our lives.
Yeah, I guess at that point he was talking about, in particular, about climate science. Uh, that was no, when was that? That was 2004. So that was 17 years ago. His article. So I quoted the clearest part of the article. The rest of the article was less clear exactly what he was saying. I mean, it was a mea culpa on his part, but kind of a half of a mea culpa. It was not clear exactly which ideas he was renouncing, but he was making clear that um, that these social constructivist ideas are dangerous because that they can be used from both sides, and maybe that brings us to the present, and to a short article that I wrote for Arc Digital just after the storming of the Capitol, um, and what I wanted to explain was um, that um, that precise that postmodernism's denial of objective reality and stress on this idea of social construction can be used from both sides, and in the end, what goes around comes around. And so, so I started saying, imagine that the election had really been stolen, and I, give a scenario where there are 4-hour lines and broken voting machines in black neighborhoods of Milwaukee and Atlanta, and thousands of absentee ballots thrown out, and blah blah, blah, where the Supreme Court, with its conservative majority, manages to steal the election for Trump. And then I say, now imagine that some small minority of activists had decided to go farther and occupy the Supreme Court building or the Capitol. Wouldn't many of us understand and sympathize with their actions, even if we didn't fully approve? And so, and then I cite polls showing how many Republican supporters supported or at least understood the storming of the Capitol, viewed it as mostly a legitimate protest, and how many Republican supporters thought that. So apparently, at least as of January, 66 to 72% of Republican voters sincerely believed that the 2020 election results were inaccurate or even fraudulent. And then I said, well, is it any surprise that 47% of them think that the assault on the Capitol was mostly legitimate, and that 17% of them outright support it? Wouldn't we feel exactly the same way were we in their place? But then I go on to say, but we're not in their place, and there is actually no symmetry between the two situations, because in my hypothetical scenario, the election really was stolen. Whereas in the 2020 election, the Trump team had lots of opportunities to challenge the results in the courts, and they did so. They filed dozens of lawsuits, and they were rejected in scathing decisions by judge after judge, including Trump's own appointees, because the evidence of fraud that they offered was just so ridiculous. So then I say, look, the fundamental problem is not just the breakdown of democratic legitimacy, it's the breakdown of consensus on basic facts. But here, right, I mean, 66% of Republicans think that the election was stolen. And so then I say the source of that delusion is obvious. Trump himself, abetted by more than half of the Republican members of Congress and amplified in the echo chambers of social media. But then here's the point. Then I try to link it to more philosophical things, I say maybe the key problem lies even deeper. It's not just the breakdown of consensus on basic facts, but the breakdown of consensus on how to determine basic facts, or maybe whether there even is such a thing as objective fact beyond mere opinion. And then I say, but alas, here the right wing wasn't the first to cast stones. And then I go through the history of how social constructivist sociologists of science, starting around 40 years ago, started to break the consensus about evidence in the real world, and how these ideas were picked up by postmodernist scholars in departments of literature mostly. And then they percolated into the rest of society, where I say they became part of the mother's milk of some sectors of the woke left. And so I quote Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, saying, there is no objective reality, no objective neutral reality. So that's a sentence that she throws out with no justification and no follow-up, almost as if it were an obvious platitude. In the middle of what the rest of the article I find is actually a rather thoughtful reflection on the intersection between race and class. She explains how she grew up, she's white, and she grew up very poor, and how race and class intersected. I thought that was very interesting. And in the middle of this, she just throws out, as if it were something that everybody knows, there is no objective neutral reality. And then I say, well, what goes around comes around. Now everyone, Trumpists included, can have their own alternative facts, as who was it? Trump's press secretary, I think, coined that phrase. And then, of course, I defend myself against misinterpretations. I say, look, I'm not claiming that postmodernist academics are responsible for the rise of the alt-right. I mean, that would be absurd. I mean, postmodernism didn't play any part in creating climate change denial, coronavirus conspiracy theories, birtherism, or QAnon. But what basically, my point is that what postmodernist relativism is wrought is something more insidious, not so much that it created all these objective untruths that the right wing is spreading, but by devaluing the concept of objective truth, it has undermined our own ability to combat those objective untruths. As one writer eloquently put it, that we need to develop herd immunity to a pandemic of viral disinformation. I mean, I think that's a nice metaphor in a time of a coronavirus pandemic, because disinformation, I mean, this word, going viral on the internet, it's not a bad analogy, because what does a virus do? A virus hijacks your own body to reproduce its RNA or DNA, and it can't reproduce on itself, and it spreads. So in the case of disinformation, I mean, a virus isn't good or bad, right? In biological evolution, organisms are not good or bad. The organisms that can reproduce more increase their numbers. It's mathematics. It's not ethics, and it's not exactly the same, but it's somewhat analogous with information on the internet. Information on the internet increases to the extent that it's good at getting itself spread.
Right, but it's being spread is not analogous to its veracity, is it?
Exactly. In fact, it may be inversely correlated with its veracity. We don't know. And so, what does herd immunity mean? Herd immunity means, so in the case of the coronavirus pandemic, if we were to reach it, what it means is there are enough people who are immune either by previous infection or by vaccination, that they don't spread it they either don't when they get it, exposed, they either don't get infected or at least don't spread it. And it's the same thing. The herd immunity in on social media, I guess, would mean that there are a larger number of people who decide not to retweet the disinformation. Um, and if the R factor, right? I mean, it's the same. Just as in the coronavirus, the R factor, the number of people that one infected person infects. If R is bigger than 1, the epidemic explodes exponentially, and very fast. If R is less than 1, it declines.
Except when you're talking about free speech and thoughts, let's say over the coronavirus, I'm sure you're aware there's been a demonetizing of Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang's channel by YouTube because of questioning various issues around the mitigation of the pandemic, ivermectin, and other issues related to the virus. And one must wonder if putting the lid on free speech might, in fact, make the R factor go up. Because as you know, there are many people on social media who are reactive. If they are told not to do something, they will want to do it 100 times more. I even have a bit of that in me. I don't want to be told I have to use certain pronouns for someone because my eyeballs work quite well. Thank you very much. You see what I mean?
No, I absolutely don't claim to have solutions. I'm not saying how one should try to reduce the retweeting of misinformation, and I don't know what's the right approach. Whether you do it by teaching people to be more thoughtful, or I really don't have a solution. I was just basically stating the mathematical fact that
Right.
that the retweets behave somewhat similarly to the way a virus is, with the difference that the what's it called in epidemiology, the infectious interval, so the interval between one infection and the next, in the case of coronavirus, is about 5 days. The time between a tweet and a retweet could be a few minutes, so that you can have an exponential explosion, not over weeks, but over hours.
But then one could make the argument that Twitter and social media and even journalism is that space to make arguments and discussions happen, in the same sense that scientists use scientific method to test if something will in fact be true or false, depending on what is being tested there. There are theories, there are experiments with various methods. And what if the social media public square is a way of not spreading disinformation, but questioning to what degree? Examples that people give all the time are, why did they tell us early on not to wear masks? Then they say that masks work. Obviously, by governments changing track on that, large swathes of the public will in fact be inclined not to believe the government in the future because they will come back with, oh, but they told us masks were bad.
I'm all in favor of freedom of speech and free debate, and I want more of it, not less. So I don't think that that clamping down on social media is the solution. I think that the solution, if there is going to be one, has to be something more difficult. It has to be educating people to be more thoughtful and less gullible, and possibly somehow getting the social media companies to do something that's against their economic interests, namely to retool their algorithms to, right now their algorithms are tuned to, to get the maximum attention to their advertisements, and maximum attention seems to mean maximum outrage, maximum emotion, and uh, maybe there has to be some way to change the incentives for them. I don't know what, but I would like to see people to be more reflective, more thoughtful, and less gullible. And 20 years ago, I had no idea that that it would come to this. I mean, I certainly did not predict that the internet would become primarily a place for the spread of disinformation. Um, and it's something that I don't have any great solutions to. In fact, the way the way I concluded my article was saying about not so much about the internet, but about the negative effects of devaluing the concept of objective truth, where 30 years ago, leftists were using it, or at least some leftists were using it. And now the right wing has figured out they can exploit it too. And I said, now the genie is out of the bottle, and I honestly don't know how to put it back in.
There's a lot to say by the way that big tech has had a hold over free speech. And again, when you try to repress that, as we found out with the Hunter Biden story in the New York Post last fall, that led to great distrust of the media. Now, as someone who came from academia to journalism 11 years ago, I had the scales fall off my eyes very quickly in this field. I was quite shocked to learn. The first thing I learned basically was there are certain papers you can't pitch certain stories to. And on the other side of that story, you could pitch to them, like the issue of gender identity. I could not pitch that to Slate. I tried it. Their science editor wrote me back with a quite insulting response. And there is no open debate anymore in journals for public consumption outside of academia any more than there is inside academia. I tried that too. The LGBT Quarterly. Years ago, when I started working on this, I still do scholarly writing. I wrote a piece, submitted it. Whoa. It didn't even go through the review process. I was pretty much no platformed from the email onward. Inversely, I and many others writing about the gender issue, we've become targeted by some very questionable for profit, quote unquote, in quotes, academic publication that's taking pot shots at feminists because now there's a market for that too. So I begin to look around and I see this vast landscape of quasi academic, but not quite, publications like Sage, not Sage as in the Virus Commission, but Sage Publication, which is doing some really
Yeah.
shoddy publishing. They ran a piece which was a reworked blog entry. It's horrible. It wouldn't pass the muster of most academic journals 30 years ago. But here we are, taking pot shots at feminists for saying that biological sex exists. And then you've got tension at the head of the Guardian Observer about what transgender politics are doing to those publications in terms of they've written out Suzanne Moore from their essence. Now she's gone on to do greater things through Substack. But to be honest, the left is undoing its own mandate to stay true to class analysis, historical materialism. Even if you're not a Marxist, even if you're a liberal, there has to be some semblance of addressing material reality. But of course, this isn't happening, Alan. So
Yeah.
here we are in 2021. Your work seems to be the holy grail for many people. You have written the preface to the French translation of Helen Pluckrose's and James Lindsay's Cynical Theories, wherein you discuss CSJ, critical social justice, and this is what you write. The history of the ideas leading to CSJ is long, but for brevity, our authors start in Paris of the 1960s with the writings of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard, what they call classic postmodernism. From these writings, they extract two philosophical principles: the postmodern knowledge principle, which displays a radical skepticism towards the possibility of objective knowledge or even objective truth, along with the cultural constructivism, and the postmodern political principle, which asserts that society is structured by systems of power and hierarchy They unconsciously organize everyone's way of thinking so as to reproduce this same system of domination. So, this is my question for you. Having read what you sent me, is it always going to be an either or scenario in the sense? Because I'm coming from anthropology, where in fact we came to understand that for what Levi Strauss gave us with post structural analysis of culture and society, that in fact that was a pushback to the ages of colonial writing about the other who becomes this sacred space today, but who 150 years ago was the noble savage and 100 years ago was the primitive. So there's been a pushback within sociology, anthropology, for instance, and then within the humanities that, if you recall, around 1992 at NYU, there were all these symposia all over the campus of re-examining Columbus's history, his legacy, because it's not just about a man sailing with ships over and discovering the Americas. The emphasis shifted to the conquest of Americas. Hence, Tsvetan Todorov's book became taught everywhere. I taught it. And is there a way that we might understand that objective scientific knowledge does exist, but also psychologically, historically, counterposed events that weigh heavily the way that slave ships were laden with black bodies and brought over? These individuals were not immigrants in the sense of many of our grandparents. These There's a history that was overwritten by a lot of the more colonial style historical trends. And I'm thinking back to Edward Said's addressing of Huntington in Orientalism. So might it be that this Sturm und Drang, as it were, this pushing and pulling of objectivity versus subjectivity, might be offered through both? It's not that science is invalid, science has its purpose and it's very important, but also subjective stories are important.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, first of all, I should say, look, I'm not an anthropologist or a historian, so I don't claim to have professional knowledge of those fields. But I mean, in history, as in any other field, there are bare facts, and then there are also interpretations, and they both matter. I mean, it's a fact. I mean, historians have tried to work out by looking at the records of ships how many Africans were taken in slavery to the Americas, and the answer seems to be somewhere around 11 million. You know, plus or minus a million or so, and that's a fact, and it's a very important fact and a very, very sad fact, that over the course of almost 500 years, 11 million people, well, I think that's the number that were taken. It's not the number that arrived, because of course about half of them died during the crossing of the Atlantic. I mean, so whatever it is, it's, you know, obviously a very horrible history. And similarly with the history of the European conquest of the Americas, I'm not, you probably know the numbers better than me, but I think it was something like 100 million Native Americans died during the first century after the European invasion, mostly from disease and not directly murdered by Europeans, but from disease that they got from the Europeans. But anyway, you know, so I mean, of course, it's true that Columbus was first and foremost a conqueror, not just a discoverer. I mean, you know, so that, I mean, you don't need post-structuralism to figure that out.
Right.
That's just straightforward history looked at. I mean, here, I mean, even simpler. You don't need post-structuralism to tell you that Columbus didn't discover America, because the Native Americans were already there, right? They had already discovered America. I mean, so just simple logic shows you that all it means is Columbus was, except for possibly the Vikings, the first European to set foot in the Americas, and that's a different story. So already, so just the idea that history should be interpreted um, through the eyes of everybody and not just through the eyes of one side. I mean, that's you don't need post structuralism to tell you that.
True, but it was used to set forth the idea that what we've been handed thus far is wrong because the texts, to quote Sweeney Todd, the history of the world, my sweet, is who gets eaten and who gets to eat. So we were sort of being told right around the 80s that all this legacy heretofore was slanted. It wasn't quite accurate, that no pilgrims didn't come over and sit down with Indians and eat Thanksgiving. And of course, I agree with you. We don't need post structuralism to set the record straight. But somehow, the idea that not just post structural theory, but that the dismemberment of everything before had to happen for us to get to this idea of a critical, socially aware space. That was part of it. This is, I guess I'm getting to one of my issues with the Pluckrose and Lindsay book. While I think it makes some very good observations, I'm not completely convinced that theory was the primary driver of what's happened recently. I think it has a role. I think it also has a role, the misinterpretations of a lot of theories. For instance, my doctoral thesis was on Judith Butler in part, and her gender trouble never told people to go out and change their sex. It doesn't even discuss that. It's completely about performativity of gender in the age where gay men were no longer dying from AIDS, that the main menu on the social justice plate at the time was same sex marriage. And we had lived through the red ribbon phase, the quilt in DC that traveled around the country. Thousands of gay men died. But then all of that shifted in 1996 with drugs that made AIDS bearable and treatable as if diabetes. So from that point onward, we saw that identity politics became, instead of let go of, and people were able to say, oh, now we can integrate, and maybe we don't need all of these things that we had to have before to hide ourselves. What happened instead was another digging in by my own community where people said, well, let's have more nights to celebrate our gayness. Fair enough. People can celebrate, people can identify. What jumped the shark was, I recall I was in Europe. I came back to New York around 1988, 89, and I found the tea added. And I remember being in a gay bar in the West Village asking friends, what's the tea? They told me, and I said, what does that have to do with us? I don't understand what a gender identity is, first of all, because it's everything that we've had to fight against in a sense, because it's a cousin to all sorts of homophobia. And what does that, as a psychiatric condition, have to do with us? And of course, I got the same old, well, remember how we were once a psychiatric condition, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, to be fair, that has nothing to do with this because we were never on the streets demanding to be viewed as heterosexuals. We were never on the streets demanding anything other than this is who we are, accept us. Let us have jobs. Let us have housing contracts. Let us get loans. Let us do all the things you can do and don't kill us, please. This lobby, however, was something quite different. And here we are then. Well, Pluckrose and Lindsay were able to look at a lot of the background to this, but I have to say that as someone who has read and taught Foucault, I don't think Foucault particularly would be behind any of this. I don't, Alan. And I tell you why, because his whole opus was about getting at the institutions that were trying to rubber stamp people in the first place.
Right. So maybe we should summarize for the listeners the Pluckrose and Lindsay book. If I can do it
Sure.
in a minute or two. So the book is called Cynical Theories, and so the point is to try to understand where is the ideology of today's so-called critical social justice or social justice warriors coming from. Why is it that you see so much intolerance of opposing views and even trying to to shut down and deplatform opposing views coming from this corner. What is the um, philosophical basis of all of this stuff? And so they trace it to postmodernism, but in stages. So they distinguish three stages: the so-called classic postmodernism of Foucault and Derrida in the 1960s. Um, and then when it crossed the Atlantic and the English Channel into the English-speaking world and became fashionable in some left-wing circles in the humanities and social sciences, it became what they called the various fields of what they call applied postmodernism. So you have post-colonial theory, critical race theory, postmodern feminism, queer theory, and various other things, which they review in successive chapters. And then they say that sometime around 2010, this began to congeal into what they call reified postmodernism, where now the postmodern principles, this postmodern knowledge principle and postmodern political principle, heretofore, I mean, which that previously had a kind of relativist sense, but now these principles are elevated to fundamental truths that cannot possibly be questioned. And so you have this bizarre 180-degree turn where from what seemed to be a radical relativism to now a dogmatic absolutism, at least about certain facts. And so, in fact, what you see in reified postmodernism is people quote social constructivist theses selectively to discredit the ideas that they dislike without having to actually address the evidence and arguments that have been made in favor of those ideas. They just immediately discredit them by saying, "Oh, that's just a social construction. That's just people with power trying to maintain their position." And then, on the other hand, their analysis of oppression is elevated to the status of an unquestionable truth, and anybody questioning it would again be criticized as just trying to to maintain their own power without having their evidence or arguments addressed. And so Pluckrose and Lindsay try to trace this evolution from classic postmodernism through applied postmodernism to reified postmodernism. And I agree with you that their sociological analysis is not completely convincing. I mean, it's not the whole story. A lot of different things were going on, and you don't just figure out what was going on by tracing the evolution of ideas. There were social things pressing in certain directions, and maybe, as some reviewers that actually I quoted in my preface, some reviewers pointed out that some of these ideas may have been seized on not because they were the logical things to do, but simply because they were useful tools, useful excuses, if you want, for the positions that people wanted to support politically for other reasons. And then one reviewer was pointing out that as these trends were taking place in academia, there were also things going on in the real world outside of academia, namely that the working class and the rights of the working class and organized labor were being battered by right-wing politicians. I mean, Margaret Thatcher first, and then and then Ronald Reagan, and subsequently. And she says, let me see if I can find what she says because it's rather eloquent. Um, she says political blows to the working class throughout the 70s and 80s left leading activists to seek power not in mass movements, but through instigating change from within state institutions, workplaces, and supranational organizations. Rather than standing on picket lines, there were human resources policies to be written. Um, and then she says that I think this is a really important point. She says, disillusioned political activists found it far easier to persuade middle class students and university lecturers of their cause, and in turn to take on board the outlook and concerns of this intellectual elite. It was far easier to play at identity politics than engage in class politics. Many activists are far more comfortable arguing that womanhood is a social construct than they are in talking to actual women who work as cleaners or carers. Academia and critical theory in particular allowed political retreat to be presented as progress and defeat as victory. And so I think that the Pluckrose and Lindsay book is very incomplete. I mean, I should say, people have criticized their analysis of particular writers and have said that maybe their analysis is inaccurate. And I think that just has to be argued on a case by case basis. I'm not an inexpert on most of those writers. I did look at some of them, some of their critiques of um, uh, um, uh, um, feminist slash anti-racism academic activists. And I did read the articles, the original articles, and it seemed to me that Pluckrose and Lindsay were correct, but could have argued their case better with more detailed quotes from these articles. But there may be other cases where they got it wrong. And I think, you may well be right, by the way, that the critical social justice people are not properly using Foucault and misinterpreted version of Foucault. That may well be true.
Well, I also think it bears to say that Judith Butler, if you recall, won a very bad writing book award way back when her first book was penned. And
Yeah.
I've taught that book. I've taught queer theory, Alan. And when I told my graduate students who could not access the entire book to just read one chapter or two, I would assign, because that book is very difficult to read. That said, I have read the book. There is absolutely no mandate for people to change their body in any way. The book was really an answer to decades and decades, centuries, one could argue, of repression of gay and lesbian lives through this notion of locating a performativity of gender, because the performativity of gender was, as many of us know, gay or straight, that when one was coming out of the closet or found out to be gay by their family, the answers were often, oh, you're really just a girl inside. And there are many men who went through shock therapy. I have friends who've been subjected to this because they were made to believe that they were born in the wrong body. Skip to the present day, and the last decade has been rife. Go to Twitter. People are actually sharing articles, Alan, of how open Pakistan is because they've elected another transgender MP, or Iran, how Iran is more open to trans people without having any historical basis as to why this might be the case. And I have my own family who is in what was once part of the Hindustani conglomerate before the separation and very next to Pakistan. My family's Gujarati. And, you know, the way women are treated in India and Pakistan depends on class. And if you are not of an upper class, you are not a Patel, you are not of a certain caste, your life as a female will definitely not be as good as being an MP who speaks Urdu living in Pakistan. The same thing for the way that Iran has historically treated homosexuals was to give one of the two of the couple the choice to transition. These are not historical facts to celebrate. And
Right.
what I find interesting, and I don't know how much time you spend on crazy social media, but
Zero. Zero. I'm not on Facebook, Twitter.
you get the Sanity of the Millennia Award, Alan, because this is rife with, on both sides of the debate as well, I have to say, because now arguing the other side is becoming its own NGO industry, if you follow me. I think we need to start dealing with facts, such as, well, there's a great scholar who's also there near you, Heather Brunskill Evans. She also has written for us. She's talked about the invention of the transgender child. And this, the fact that we need to even be discussing the fact that children shouldn't be ingrained with some kind of fiction from birth or within education that they are transgender, that their sex was assigned to them at birth. All of these fictions have now formed part of a larger ideological strategy, oftentimes within the school system. It's happening in the UK, it's happening in the US. You have two teachers on the west coast of the US who were put on leave because they pushed back. One was a principal of a school, and then the teacher working at the same school. So women are being punished quite sadistically for saying female is a sex, women are adult human females, anything like that. It will get you fired, it will get you even kicked out of your flat.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I mean, obviously, you know a lot more about this issue than I do, but yeah, somehow it's amazing that the I mean, trans rights means a bunch of different things. I mean, if it means that everybody should be allowed to live their lives in dignity without being hassled and without being discriminated against, I'm in favor of it. Everybody's in favor of it. But if it means that other people are going to be obliged to treat you as if you're a member of the sex that you claim to be a member of, even if you're not, that's a different story. And somehow, until recently, somehow trans rights managed to pose as the first completely unobjectionable thing, managed to present itself as, the next stage for people who supported gay rights. This is the next stage in the struggle for human rights. And maybe people are now only waking up to the fact that gender self-identification is a quite different ideology. It's not about people's individual rights. It's about imposing on everyone else that they have to behave towards you in a certain way and have to allow you into single sex spaces that maybe you don't belong. But I was also very struck when I was reading Helen Joyce's recent book, Trans, um, by when she talks, she cites curricular materials from, I guess, elementary schools, for 8-year-olds in Australia, Canada, at least, where they would say, in order to, situate your gender identity, consider a continuum between GI Joe at one end and Barbie at the other, and then situate yourself somewhere in between. And I mean, I was just totally shocked. I mean, didn't we figure out 50 years ago? I mean, didn't 1970s feminists figure out that, like G.I. Joe and Barbie are both a lot of bullshit? And I don't want to situate myself on a continuum between them. I want to, be a human being, and I don't like either G.I. Joe or Barbie. And and similarly, if you have what do you call a girl? I don't know, a 4-year-old girl who prefers pants to dresses and who prefers sports to dolls. I call her a girl who prefers pants to dresses and sports to dolls.
This is what I don't think a lot of the trans lobby, and that means both trans people and their supporters. And by the way, not all trans people. This is a very militant group I'm speaking about, but they do not understand why we could be offended because, as you said, we just want to be human. I don't run around. I'm not talking to you any differently, Alan, because you are male. In fact, I would hope that our ethos in life as we grow and really grow together, even as humans, is to understand that fundamentally, aside from our reproductive organs, there's very little that separates us. I mean, you could like or hate chess just as I could like or hate chess. You could like or hate hiking. This has very little to do with our genitalia. And I'm constantly alarmed by how we were sold trans over the past 20 years, because that's when it's really popped on the scene at the end of the 90s, as we're breaking the gender binary. That's what they would say 10 years ago. That's shifted slightly, but there's no binary being broken. It's a entrenchment of stereotypes.
Exactly. I mean, feminists broke this binary 50 years ago, right? I mean, you can be a
Yeah.
woman and like dresses or like sports. I mean, you can be a woman and like what you want. You can be a man and like what you want. Um, and yeah, the but you know what you said about the differences between men and women, it reminds me of a brilliant thing that was written many years ago by Katha Pollitt, the one of the columnists for the Nation, left wing magazine in the United States, and she was reviewing. There was this famous book. What was it? Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. It was like a best-selling book about the alleged huge differences between men and women. And she said, no, it's more like men are from Illinois and women are from Indiana. You know, different, but not so different.
This is what I think the lobby is missing, because it's a gender lobby. It's not just a trans lobby, it's a lobby of, because they're joined by a lot of men's rights activists. And there's a lot of misogyny thick within the rhetoric, such that just the other day, J.K. Rowling,
Yeah.
she's at it with these activists who are now threatening her with a pipe bomb. And her retorts to the violence are patently brilliant. But this is what I don't understand, why the people backing this, and these are many academics of the quote unquote left. I put quote unquote left, Alan, because I have to question anyone who's behind something that denies historical reality and material reality. And then you've got politicians pushing on this, including in the UK, the Labour Party was torn asunder over this. This is a large part of the reason why Corbynism failed. He focused on pronouns, not housing. And then you have the same in the US. This is happening now, where Biden has basically signed out women's rights for Title IX protections. Or now you have sports women who are being pushed out of competing in this year's Tokyo Olympics because a weightlifter who's a man is calling himself a woman. In the postmodern condition, Jean-Francois Lyotard talks about language games. That's his term. And we're seeing language games being used against women. So when you say, didn't women do that 50 years ago? Yes. But what is it that men are now saying, but we'll do it better? Men are telling us how to do feminism. Men are telling us that we're not women, we're cervix havers, we're uterus havers, we're front holers. I swear to God, that's one of them. We've been called everything under the sun.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I mean, in principle, this gender self ID goes in both directions, but somehow the mantra is trans women are women. And there's not so much stress that trans men are men.
Ironically, they know what sex is, and they know very well that the lobby they're pumping up is a very male dominated lobby.
What struck me about when I was reading Helen Joyce's book is how strongly the the idea seems to be that you have somehow inside you some ineffable gender, some ineffable true gender, something like a true soul, that is totally independent from your actual biological sex. But what is the definition of this ineffable gender? It seems to be defined solely by old-fashioned stereotypes, which, I mean, I just find it bizarre that 50 years later, these stereotypes are being resurrected. But, maybe things have been happening in these 50 years that I've been oblivious to. I mean, when I was growing up, when I was an undergraduate, that was at the height of the feminism, and all of us, men and women, were affected by it and took it to heart. And maybe it's several generations later, and maybe things have changed in ways that I didn't realize. Um, and the same, by the way, just to put it in this broader context of the critical social justice in general, is it that large parts of the left have become so opposed to freedom of expression? I mean, the Mario Savio and the people of the Berkeley free speech movement of 1964 would be turning over in their graves. At that point, the left was defending free speech because they knew perfectly well that when free speech is curtailed, um, it's the left and the oppressed who feel the brunt of it. And now well, there are attacks on free speech from both sides, but it seems to be coming more strongly from the so-called left, and that worries me. Why are people so offended by an idea that's different from theirs that they have to shut it down, that they can't listen calmly to it and refute it? And it can only make me conjecture that the reason they do it is because they know in their hearts that they don't know how to refute it. Not necessarily that it can't be refuted, but just they don't know how to refute it because they haven't thought carefully enough about it to know how to refute it. They've only accepted what they believe is dogma and haven't actually confronted it with opposing ideas. And when I realized all of this is discussed by John Stuart Mill in 1859 in his essay on liberty. He discusses that. He discusses how one of the negative consequences of censorship is that even when people are right, they don't know why they're right, that it's a dogma rather than a consequence of reason, because they don't know the arguments against their position, and they don't know the stronger arguments in favor of their position. And it's really sad that now it's 160 years since John Stuart Mill, and we have to revisit that.
What do we do when people actually believe something that if everyone wasn't being gaslighted, we would all know is a hoax? And this is what a feminist wrote me. I'm reading her question because it's very important that we can discuss something where we all know that there's gaslighting going on, such as the female penis. Really? In what world?
I was absolutely shocked when I read, I mean, I'm sure you know the case of Maya Forstater here in England. So she was a gender critical feminist who, didn't lose her job, had her contract as a consultant for a development organization not renewed because some of her co-workers took offense at her gender critical tweets and her defense of the idea that there is such a thing as biological sex. And so it went to court, and at the first employment tribunal ruled against her and made an amazing, just a totally shocking characterization that her views were something like repugnant in a democratic society, or something, or incompatible with a democratic society. And so the idea that so it's a little bit bizarre. I mean, as was pointed out by her lawyers on appeal, and they ended up winning the appeal. Her lawyers pointed out, until recently, it was taken for granted that there are two sexes, one male and one female. And certainly all of English law was based on that, at the very least until the Gender Recognition Act changed that. And so this traditional point of view, which is presumably the one that's also taken 80% of the population, is now considered to be somehow on a par with Nazism, because though that was the kind of view that, according to the European law, would somehow forfeit its right to freedom of speech. And so it's very strange that the idea that there is such a thing as a male sex and a female sex is now considered to be abhorrent, something that most people just consider to be common sense.
Is the left maybe plagued with the problem of we need to understand that maybe less is more, in the sense of, this is a question I've had with myself in my lockdown thinking moments, of maybe we keep trying to push on rights. We like to say on the left, human rights, and goodness knows I work on that issue, but I work on human rights where there's actually human rights in the balance. And I have to wonder if the left, especially in the relatively wealthy West, we are abusing the terms human rights. Does a man have a human right to even stress his own identity, in a sense, legally? Prisons, hospital wards. What is it about the left that has become so obsessed, even, I'd have to say at this point, with the notion of individuality and selfhood, where the left of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was working on far other different strategies, right?
Yeah, and it's, again, part of this broader issue that I brought up, and that would be another long discussion of another 3 hours. The tension between focusing on economic class and focusing on identity issues such as gender or sex and race. There definitely has been in the left in Western countries a trend against dealing with class issues and towards dealing with these identity issues. And I wonder whether part of that is maybe uncertainty about what would be helpful policies that would favor the working class. But I think it's also that the traditional left parties have come to be less and less based in the working class and more based in the upper middle class, and therefore reflect the issues that are important to the upper middle class, and those identity issues are more important than economic issues to people who are already economically fairly well off. I mean, I think that Joanna Williams was absolutely right. She said about the Pluckrose Lindsay book that that one thing they did point out, but not as much, I think, as they should, that, you know, her line about people are more comfortable saying that womanhood is a social construction than they are talking to actual women who work as cleaners and carers. And I think that's a really good point. I think we should be thinking more about the actual women who work as cleaners and carers, and the actual men who work in working class jobs and get badly paid.